Hi, this is Jens Soering, and I'm the guy who spent 33 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. If that weren't bad enough, after my release, Netflix put out a series that really did not portray the case in a fair and accurate light. That's why I've been making these videos with a bunch of the police officers who worked on the case. And today, I've actually got one of the stars of the series, maybe the star, DNA scientist, Professor J. Thomas McClintock of Liberty University. This is actually the first time I've ever gotten to speak with him in person, and I'm really excited about what he has to tell us. Dr. McClintock, please introduce yourself and tell our viewers a little bit about who you are professionally, all the cases you worked on.
Well, it is nice to finally meet you after all these years. My name is Dr. J. Thomas McClintock. I founded a company called DNA Diagnostics, Inc. back in 1993, and it is a consulting service where we provide guidance to attorneys, to law firms, state agencies, federal agencies that are working cases, whether it's criminal or civil, that utilizes DNA technology. I've been involved with this for many, many years, almost several decades now. And it's a passion. I've had close to 600 cases. Out of those 600, I probably have testified in about 10% of those cases where I truly believe that the interpretation of the data was not necessarily correct, maybe exaggerated a bit. So any sort of case that is utilizing DNA technology for human identification or parentage verification, I have assisted those individuals over the years. I'm presently a professor and the director of the Forensic Science program in the Department of Biology and Chemistry at Liberty University, which is in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Would you tell our viewers, how did you get involved in my case?
Well, it was back in, I believe, 2017, an attorney called me, Mr. Rosenfield, and asked me a few questions about my background and if I would be interested in helping him with the client, you, and just take a look at some of the reports that the Virginia Department of Forensic Science generated. And then also just wanted to see if I could just give him some answers.
So one of the issues that has been raised, and I'll go into this right now at the beginning of this video, is did he offer you bags of money to reach conclusions that were favorable to me, as has been alleged by some people here in Germany?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that, because when I'm retained by a client, we go through some paperwork, and I try to emphasize that they are paying me for my time, not my answer that's favorable for their client. So Mr. Rosenfield offered me, I believe it's a little bit under $200 just to establish a relationship, a client-attorney relationship that I would consult with him before I would speak to someone else. So bags of money, no, never have had that. And he never offered, and I never requested funding.
And $200, that's about 1 hour of your professional time, right?
That's probably about a quarter of it.
Oh, well, I got a real break. I got 15 minutes of your time.
Absolutely.
How much time did you actually spend on the case estimate in total?
Probably at this point, it's close to 150 hours. There was some years that I believe once you were released, I didn't really have a whole lot of interaction with the team, for lack of a better word. But up to that point, it's been probably 100 hours. And then from 2022, probably another easy 50 hours.
Well, in that case, I'd have to do the math in my head, but I'm figuring I owe you several tens of thousands of dollars just for your normal rate. Dr. McClintock, I will not be able to pay this. I'm not able to pay you for today either.
No worries.
Thank you. Now, you also looked at not just the state forensic lab reports, but also a report or two, actually, possibly, written by Professor Moses Shanefield of George Washington University. who also spent a lot of time on this case. And I know that in one of your reports, you said that you were in general agreement with his findings. Without going into details, you were aware of Professor Shanefield and his work.
I was when Mr. Rosenfield contacted me, and once I provided a summary, I received Dr. Shanefield's report, and we were generally in agreement with our observations or the interpretation of the data.
To the best of your knowledge, Professor Shanefield ever mention any bags of money going to him either?
No, we never had an opportunity to talk about that, nor did, he called me and asked me, but I would assume it's the same setup as I had with Mr. Rosenfield.
Yeah, it was actually, in fact, he also got about $200 just to establish a professional relationship. Okay, let's talk about your findings. When you examined the serology report from 1985 and the DNA report from 2009, you did this in 2017 while I was still in prison as part of the pardon petition. What conclusions did you draw? Can you summarize your conclusions?
Well, there was a lot of data and information to look at. The serology I did review. My emphasis was on the DNA aspect of these evidentiary samples that were presented to me. And Mr. Rosenfield did point out there were a few samples that were of particular interest, but I looked through all of the samples to see what sort of interpretation I would come up with, of course, and see if that interpretation was identical or matched that from Virginia Department of Forensic Science, or DFS. I was also looking at the possibility of mixtures, and that's with 3 or 4 of those samples. And what I found was none of the DNA profiles that I looked at from the crime scene, none of them matched your DNA profile.
So there is, as far as one can tell from the forensic reports, not even one chromosome of my DNA anywhere at that crime scene.
Well, specifically what forensic DNA analysts do is they look at different sites along the DNA, and it's along different chromosomes, and these sites or addresses are called loci or a locus. And alleles are produced at these sites. An allele is basically a piece of DNA that codes for different traits. So for instance, I think everyone would agree there's different eye colors. So there's different alleles for those different eye colors, just as an example. So if I were to ask the question, does Jens Soering's allelic profile or DNA profile, did I find that at the scene, or did I find that from different evidentiary samples? I would say no. Your DNA profile did not match any of the samples that I looked at.
And that is the same conclusion reached by the Department of Forensic Sciences and Professor Shanefield of George Washington University. And then there's also somebody else that looked at this as well. He also reached this conclusion, Dr. Dan Crane of Wright University.
Correct. I think we all reached the same agreement.
In your report of 2017, did you reach the conclusion that the DNA evidence suggested the presence at the crime scene of 2 unknown contributors? We don't know whether they were perpetrators, but 2 unknown contributors at the crime scene.
So when you look at the DNA profiles, you can determine the gender of the contributor to that sample. And the samples that I looked at were all from males. And then moreover, when I looked at the serology, those samples were different in terms of blood type. So it would suggest at least 1, if not 2 other males were present at that crime scene.
Okay, 1 or 2 other males who had a different DNA profile from me.
Absolutely.
And of course, we can never know who those two males are because these are very partial profiles with only a few alleles.
That's correct.
Now, after my release, some people who I will colloquially refer to as nitwits suggested that there might have been a mixture anyway. And because this rumor wouldn't die down, one of my attorneys, Steve Northrop, and I contacted you in the summer of 2022 and asked you to return to the Virginia Department of Forensic Sciences, the state lab, to check this out. Would you tell us about how that happened? When did you go to the Department of Forensic Sciences and what did you do? Tell us the story.
Well, Mr. Northrop had contacted me and essentially said, if I can work out the details for you to go to the Virginia Department of Forensic Science, would you be willing to go there and look at the case file? You can focus on, the particular samples that you looked at earlier, plus look at other samples. So with that said, a few days after that, there was an email exchange where Mr. Northrop did say that Virginia Department of Forensic Science is willing to allow you to come to their agency and look at the case file. So I went to Richmond, Virginia, which is about an hour and a half east of where I'm located in Lynchburg. Got there early in the morning, and during that time, I did meet the director of Virginia DFS in terms of she's the director of all of the 4 labs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And she escorted me to the area where I would be receiving the documents, but I would also have an individual sit in the same conference room as me. And I was agreeable to that. I've done that before where I've gone to state, federal, private labs, and generally I'm not going to be by myself. I cannot make copies of any of the material. It has to all be handwritten by myself. So that was an experience. I spent probably 8 hours in the laboratory. So I went through all the data and generated a report for Mr. Northrop. So what I tell counsel when I work with them, you can definitely send me the certificate of analyses, but there's only 2 decisions you have to make. Do you believe that certificate as being correct? Or do you want an unbiased scientific review of that certificate and all the raw data that supports that certificate?
And that's what you provided in this case, an unbiased view of several hundred pages of raw data of the DNA tests that were performed in 2009 on this case.
That's correct. There were hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence to look at. I tell counsel that I am not going to jeopardize your name, my company's name, by giving you an answer that's possibly favorable to your client. I'm going to look at the data and render an unbiased scientific review because I really don't have any, for lack of a better word, a dog in the race. I just look at the science, and the science and the data will tell me what I need to know.
Could you please explain the significance of your results for a lay audience like myself?
Well, all of the samples that I reviewed, they were single source, meaning no mixtures. And serology would support that as well. But the DNA is much more sensitive, much more state-of-the-art. And so all of these samples show different individuals were present. I did not see any of your alleles. I did not see your DNA profile, which I have. Even if you wanted to, you could not have contributed, to any of those samples.
So your work in 2022, 3 years after my release, essentially, would you say, confirmed your earlier findings that there was probably two unknown contributors who left their DNA, their blood at the crime scene?
Absolutely.
That's important to me because after my release, those findings were called into question. But your work in 2022, would you say, did they answer that question?
I think it definitely supported the earlier theory, and it also supported the fact that the samples were all single source, meaning only one contributor and not mixtures.
And that's important to me because those people who think I'm guilty have put out this theory that these samples were in fact mixtures, and that some part of me, some part of my blood was somehow part of these samples. But your work has eliminated that possibility.
Yes, sir. Correct.
Now, would you feel comfortable in saying that this has strengthened the case for my innocence beyond what was known in 2017? Would you feel comfortable with that?
I believe so. Yes, sir. The information, the data that I looked at in 2022, obviously I had seen some of it earlier in 2017, but I think it's definitely, I don't want to say duplicative, but it definitely, the latter interpretation of the data supports the earlier findings.
None of this was contained in the Netflix series about my case that was released a year later after you went to the DFS, to the state lab. And that leaves me wondering, did you tell the Netflix team about your review of the raw data in 2022? Was that part of your interviews with Netflix?
It was. Netflix sent a crew of, I believe, 6 people, 4 to 6 people, lots of instrumentation, cameras, and they literally filmed, I would say, at least 3 hours in one of my laboratories. So they spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time with them talking about my findings. And that went back to the letter of 2017 and also the summary report in 2022. So I went into quite a bit of detail. They had a lot of questions that they asked me, and I answered them appropriately, but none of that information was on show for the Netflix documentary.
And you know that I'm absolutely outraged by this. I think it's a really evil thing that they did, that they basically excluded all of the work you did on this case, or most of the work that you did on this case, and left out, really, in some ways, the most important part, which was your review of the raw data in the summer of 2022. Those are my feelings, though. Do you want to go ahead and talk about your feelings? How do you feel about that?
I was honestly shocked after so much time and effort, getting everything set up, getting an agreeable time and date for everyone, and to find out that none of that was displayed on the documentary. I felt cheated. I felt that, I don't want to say I was lied to, but my expectations were that they were going to, present that scientific interpretation of the raw data that I looked at. I thought that was the goal of trying to find the truth through science. And it didn't happen. And in fact, talking to colleagues that are not experienced in DNA, whether they're scientists or, I don't want to say just a layperson, but someone that's non-scientifically minded, all of them have agreed they do not understand the 4th episode. It just did not fall in line with the other 3 episodes in the presentation. So it was frustrating. I think at that point, as I've done earlier in my career, I want to see what you're going to show before you release it. It's like a press article that's being released. Many reporters don't allow you to look at that proof before it's published. So that's frustrating because they could take a phrase out of context. And I think just the last thing with that fourth episode, I had never met this fella, Andrew Hammel, and I didn't understand why he would be presenting the DNA. It just seemed out of context. And my cameo was literally walking through a door in the dark.
Yeah, I must say I was shocked by that as well. The person you're referring to is not a DNA scientist. He is somebody who has an inactive law license. And according to his LinkedIn page, he's a translator. Why a translator? Which is an honorable profession, but why a translator gets to present DNA evidence is a mystery to me, especially since you had new findings, actually new evidence from the summer of 2022.
Well, one thing I haven't shared with you is Andrew Hammel emailed me twice. I did not respond because that summer I was going through medical procedures that took a lot of time of healing. That was in July. In November, I had another major medical issue that took me, let's say I'm still trying to recover from it at this point. So the accusations were that I hid. I was in denial, where in fact I was trying to recover from two major medical operations. Moreover, information was, I don't want to say published, but an article was revealed, written by Andrew Hammel, that was false. In other words, I didn't respond to his emails because I was in hiding. Well, I was recovering. The other thing is I had a team of forensic science majors. We always have research projects going on. And I had about 4 students that were working on a project on the effect of Coca-Cola on its ability to remove blood. And we found, and I have the manuscript that I'm ready to send off, that information has not been really revealed. But we found that Coca-Cola was not very effective at removing fresh or latent blood stains using luminol or other presumptive tests. Now, here's the fake part. Hammel said I went out and bought a 1985 Chevy Chevette that was analogous to the rented car that you all apparently had. And I was going to use that vehicle to soak in blood and then ask the question about luminol. I never bought a 1985 Chevy Chevette. I laughed at that. I was able to buy carpet, from brand new carpet for a 1985 Chevette for $160. And we were using that carpet to answer some of these questions that we asked. So in other words, there was a lot of false information that's out there. You know, as you said earlier about monetary reimbursement, you know, I'm putting myself out on the line, out on the limb, because everyone's going to have an opinion and it's not necessarily going to be similar to mine.
I did not know about this issue with Andrew Hammel making that statement in this article, but I'm not surprised. It's not the only one by a long, long shot. Just to explain for our viewers what the issue with the Coca-Cola and the blood in the car is about. A rental car was used to drive to the crime scene. Elizabeth Haysom testified that I returned in that rental car covered, and this is a quote, almost word for word, from head to toe in blood. She claimed that she then removed this blood with Coca-Cola. Then the car was tested with luminol and no blood was found. And the defense, in other words, I have always maintained this cannot possibly be true. Coca-Cola cannot remove blood to the point that it is not found by luminol. And that's why you performed this test, to show that Elizabeth Haysom's story, what she testified to in court, is scientifically impossible.
That's correct. We've published an article on luminol detection of blood. And those samples were at that time 151 years old. And luminol was really the only presumptive test that showed a positive response to the blood stains.
So when they performed the luminol test on the car about 2 or 3 months after the crime, they would have definitely found blood if it had been present.
Absolutely.
And Coca-Cola would not have removed it.
Not from our studies. Our data doesn't even come near to suggesting that Coca-Cola is very efficient. We use some different types of carpet, different colors, different textures, and one, Coca-Cola makes a stain. But we went through and washed some of those samples with water and did luminol testing. And we varied the exposure time of Coca-Cola on fresh and latent blood up to like 7 days after the blood was deposited, washed, dried, and still luminol lit up those samples.
Well, I am sure, Dr. McClintock, that Andrew Hammel is going to write an article somewhere telling the two of us that we're completely wrong about that and that he has full insight into the efficacy of Coca-Cola. And if only he had been allowed to perform the test, he would have shown that you and I are both wrong, and Elizabeth Haysom was, of course, telling the truth.
As I said earlier, everyone has an opinion. And if it's going to glorify them, go for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. McClintock, for speaking with us today and telling us about your findings, which have resolved one of the really central issues of this case. Were those 4 key blood samples mixtures, were they contaminated? Thank you for telling us about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you.